Welcome to my channel.
The rain in Lochdubh did not fall so much as it hovered, a fine grey haar that clung to the wool of Hamish Macbeth's jumper and turned the surrounding peaks of Ben Bruey into ghost-white monoliths. It was the sort of morning that demanded a fire, a pot of strong coffee, and an absolute minimum of official police business. Hamish sat on a damp rock by the edge of the river and Dub, his long, lanky frame hunched over a fishing rod that he wasn't technically supposed to be using. Beside him, his dog Lugs, a creature of uncertain pedigree and even more uncertain temperament, sat with one ear cocked, watching the water with the same opportunistic glint as his master. "Just the one, Lugs," Hamish murmured, his voice a soft Highland lilt. "Just one small sea trout for the pan, and the world will be none the wiser." Hamish was a man whose hazel eyes held a deceptive blankness, a look that had led many a criminal and many a superior officer to dismiss him as a simpleton. It was a reputation he cultivated as carefully as a prize-winning marrow. If people thought you were thick, they talked. And if they talked, you didn't have to work nearly as hard to find things out. His peace was shattered by the aggressive, high-pitched whine of a high-performance engine echoing through the glen, a silver Porsche, looking entirely out of place against the rugged, mud-streaked landscape, tore along the narrow road, splashing a wall of peat-stained water over the verge. The car screeched to a halt near the bridge, and out stepped a man who looked as though he had been curated by an expensive London boutique for a country weekend shoot. He wore a brand-new barber jacket that hadn't yet seen a drop of real dirt and a pair of bright yellow Wellington boots. "You there, Constable!" the man shouted, waving a leather-bound map. Hamish sighed, slowly stood up, and tucked his rod behind a gorse bush. He ambled toward the road with the agonizingly slow gait of a man who had nowhere to be and all day to get there. "I?" Hamish asked, leaning against a fence post. "I'm Julian Vane. I've just taken the lease on Ardvare Lodge," the man said, his English accent sharp and entitled. He looked at Hamish's unpolished boots and the stray bit of heather clinging to his red hair with visible distaste. "The heating is out. The locals at the pub were spectacularly unhelpful, and I'm told the policeman is the only one who knows how to make things move in this god-forsaken drizzle." "Ardvare, is it?" Hamish said, ignoring the insult to his village. "Big place, cold. It takes a certain temperament to live up there in the winter. It takes money and taste, both of which seem to be in short supply around here," Vane snapped. "I'm hosting a shooting party this weekend. Important people. I want the riffraff kept away from my perimeter. I saw some local characters prowling near my gates this morning. A scruffy man with a limp. See to it." "That would be Angus the post," Hamish said mildly. "He's got a bad hip, but he generally delivers the mail before he prowls." Vane scoffed, climbed back into his car and revved the engine. "Just do your job, Macbeth. I pay enough in taxes to buy and sell this little hamlet. I expect service, not sarcasm." The Porsche roared, leaving a cloud of exhaust fumes to mingle with the Highland mist. Hamish watched it disappear, his eyes narrowing. "Lugs," Hamish said to the dog, who had wandered up to sniff a discarded cigarette butt Vane had dropped. "I have a feeling Mr. Vane is going to find that Lochdubh has a very long memory for people who call its postman riffraff." He looked back at the river. The trout were no longer biting, the mood was spoiled. With a heavy heart and a growling stomach, Hamish headed back toward the village, unaware that Julian Vane's important people would soon be the least of the newcomer's problems. The following morning did nothing to improve the temperament of the Highlands. A biting wind had whipped up from the Atlantic, carrying with it a sleet that stung the skin like tiny needles. Hamish Macbeth had spent a restless night in the police station, his sleep disturbed by the rattling of the window frames and the rhythmic snoring of Lugs. He had just finished his first pot of coffee, the dark, bitter liquid finally clearing the cobwebs from his brain, when the telephone on his desk gave a sharp, demanding jangle. It was Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife. her voice crackling with a mixture of excitement and manufactured horror that usually meant something terrible had happened to someone she didn't particularly like. "Hamish, you must get up to the old, standing stones above Ardvare Lodge immediately," she trilled, her breath hitching in a way that suggested she had run at least 20 yards before reaching a phone. "It's that newcomer, Mr. Vane. He's in a state. A very permanent state, I should think. Young Geordie was up there looking for a stray sheep and nearly tripped over him. The boy is fair terrified, Hamish." Hamish sighed, looking regretfully at the remaining inch of coffee in his mug. The Lochdubh piece had lasted exactly 24 hours since Julian Vane's arrival. "I'm on my way, Mrs. Wellington. Tell Geordie to stay put and not touch a single thing, not even a blade of grass." He pulled on his heavy greatcoat and whistled for lugs. The drive up the winding track toward Ardvare was a treacherous affair, the Land Rover sliding precariously on the slick mud. As he approached the circle of ancient, weather-beaten stones that sat on a plateau overlooking the loch, he saw the silver Porsche parked haphazardly on the verge, its sleek frame already coated in a layer of mountain grit. Geordie, a lad of 14 with a face currently the colour of skimmed milk, was standing by the road, hugging himself against the cold. Hamish climbed out, his long legs unfolding like a carpenter's rule. He patted Geordie on the shoulder as he passed. "Easy now, lad. Go sit in the Land Rover. There's a flask of tea in the glove box. Drink it." He walked toward the centre of the stone circle. There, slumped against the largest of the megaliths, locally known as the Weeping Finger, was Julian Vane. He was no longer the picture of London's sartorial elegance. He was dressed in his pristine shooting tweeds, but they were now soaked through and stained with something dark and viscous. Vane was seated upright, his back against the cold stone, but his head was tilted back at an impossible, sickening angle. His mouth was open as if to register one final, silent complaint about the Scottish weather. However, it was the manner of his death that gave Hamish pause. Propped in Vane's lap was a large silver serving platter, the kind used for formal dinners at the lodge. Arranged neatly upon it was a single raw sea trout, its glazed eye staring up at the dead man with a vacant irony. Around Vane's neck, tied in a neat professional bow, was a length of common orange baling twine. "Dear, oh dear," Hamish muttered, crouching down. He didn't touch the body, but his hazel eyes moved with a predatory sharpness that contradicted his slumped posture. He noted the lack of struggle in the surrounding turf. The sleet had washed away any clear footprints, but the positioning of the body was deliberate, almost theatrical. It was a murder designed to humiliate. Julian Vane, who had complained about riffraff and salmon poaching, had been served up like a main course in his own private theatre. Lugs approached the body, his tail tucked between his legs. He let out a low, mournful whine and refused to sniff the trout. Dogs, Hamish knew, had a better sense of the macabre than humans. The silence of the glen was suddenly shattered by the distant, discordant blare of a police siren. Hamish winced. That would be the Strathbane boys. Minutes later, a convoy of white police Fords came screaming up the track, led by a car that took the corners with a reckless disregard for suspension. It skidded to a halt, spraying Hamish and Lugs with a fresh coat of slush. Out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man whose physical presence was defined by a massive stomach, a face the shade of an overripe plum, and an ego that required its own zip code. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the standing stones. "I might have known I'd find you loitering at a crime scene. Why haven't you cordoned this off? Why are you standing there like a stuffed gannet?" "I only just arrived, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a thick, subservient Highland burr. "I was just making sure the lad who found him was all right. He's fair shook, as we say. I don't care about some local turnip cruncher's feelings." Blair stomped toward the body, his breath coming in ragged tobacco-stained gasps. He stopped when he saw trout on a silver platter. He let out a bark of laughter that held no mirth. "Well, well, looks like our Sassenach friend overstayed his welcome. It's obvious, isn't it? Poachers. Vane caught someone stealing from the river, and the local thugs decided to send a message. It's a classic case of peasant resentment." Blair turned to his assistant, the sycophantic Detective Sergeant Anderson, who was busy trying to keep his own shoes out of the mud. "Anderson, get the names of every known poacher within 20 miles. Start with that one Hamish usually drinks with, what's his name, Billy the Fish? And check Macbeth's freezer while you're at it. I wouldn't be surprised if he's in on the take." Hamish stood by, his expression one of vacant bewilderment. He watched as Blair's team trampled over the site, destroying what little forensic evidence the rain hadn't already claimed. He noticed something Blair hadn't: a small blue silk thread caught on a jagged edge of the standing stone about shoulder height. He also noticed that while Van's boots were muddy, the soles were remarkably clean of the thick, grey clay that dominated the centre of the stone circle. "It's a terrible business, sir," Hamish said softly, squinting at the horizon. "A man killed on his own land. Though I wonder why he'd walk all the way up here in the middle of a storm just to sit down and have a fish dinner." "He didn't walk, you idiot," Blair snapped. "He was obviously dragged, or lured. It's a backdoor job, typical Highlands. You lot are all related and you're all hiding something. Now get out of my sight, back to your little station and stay by the phone. If I want a local's opinion on sheep shearing, I'll ask. Otherwise, leave the real police work to the professionals." Hamish nodded obediently, touched his cap, and whistled for lugs. As he walked back to the Land Rover, his mind was already moving away from poachers and silver platters. He was thinking about the Ardvere shooting party Vane had mentioned. A silver platter required a kitchen required staff, and a man like Julian Vane required an audience for his arrogance. The play had begun, but Blair was looking at the props while the lead actors were still in the wings. "Come on, lugs," Hamish whispered as he climbed into the driver's seat. "We've a lot of tea to drink, and a lot of lies to listen to." The Land Rover rumbled down the track, leaving the chaos of DCI Blair's shouting and the frantic snapping of police cameras behind. Hamish drove slowly, his eyes scanning the verges not for clues, but for the general rhythm of the morning. He knew that in a place like Lochdubh, news travelled faster than the wind off the Atlantic. By the time he reached the village main street, the air would already be thick with the distorted versions of the truth. He dropped Geordie off at his mother's cottage, ensuring the boy had a warm heart and a stern instruction from his mother to keep his mouth shut, an instruction that Hamish knew would be ignored the moment he turned the corner. Hamish parked the Land Rover outside the post office, the engine giving a tired wheeze as it died. He didn't head for the station. Instead, he adjusted his cap and stepped into the small, cluttered shop that smelled of old paper, peppermint humbugs, and damp wool. Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, was behind the counter, her spectacles perched on the very tip of her nose. She was currently engaged in a very intense, very slow sorting of the morning's mail with Nessie and Jessie Curry, the village's twin sisters, who functioned as a sort of local intelligence agency. "A sad day, Hamish," Mrs. Kennedy said, not looking up from a gas bill. "A terrible day for Glen tourism. To think a man was found dead in a stone circle with a trout. It's pagan, that's what it is." Hamish leaned against the counter, his posture relaxing into that deceptive, boneless slouch. "News travels fast, Mrs. Kennedy. I haven't even filed my notes yet. How did you hear about the trout?" "Young Geordie's cousin works at the hotel," Jessie piped up, her eyes gleaming, "and she was talking to the delivery man who saw the silver car. But the trout, Hamish, was it poached? There's a rumour it was one of yours." Hamish gave a slow, self-deprecating smile. "Now, Jessie, you know I'm a law-abiding officer of the peace. My trout are all strictly legal and accounted for. But tell me, what was the talk at the hotel last night? Mr. Vane seemed like a man who liked to impress. Did he have his shooting party guests with him?" "He did indeed," Nessie said, leaning in so close that Hamish could smell the lavender water on her shawl. "A sour-faced lot, if you ask me. There was a colonel with a moustache that looked like a hedge trimmer, and a young woman, very fashionable, very thin, who complained that the Lochdubh hotel didn't serve almond milk. Fancy that, in a village surrounded by cows. And did they seem to like Mr. Vane? Hamish asked, his voice a low, encouraging murmur. Like him? Mrs. Kennedy snorted. They looked like they were attending a funeral before the man was even dead. The colonel was heard shouting in the lobby about a bad investment and ruined reputations, and the young lady, a Miss Penelope something or other, was seen crying in the conservatory. People don't cry over Julian Vane out of love, Hamish. They cry because he's holding the purse strings. Hamish nodded, absorbing the information. He knew the type. Vane had been a man who bought his friends and then treated them like subordinates. Such relationships were fragile, especially when the money started to dry up or the investments turned sour. He bid the ladies a polite good morning and wandered down toward the harbour, where the salt spray was crusting on the windows of the local pub, the Tommel Castle. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued. A few local fishermen sat in the corner, nursing half-pints and looking suspiciously at the door. Hamish didn't go to the bar. He sat by the peat fire and waited. Within 5 minutes, Archie McLean, a man whose knowledge of the local waterways was surpassed only by his knowledge of where the best illegal stills were hidden, slid into the seat opposite him. "Blair's looking for poachers, Archie," Hamish said quietly, watching the flames. "Blair's a fool," Archie spat. "No poacher in the Highlands would waste a good fish on a dead Sassenach. And no poacher uses orange baling twine for a garrote. That's farmer's gear, or maybe someone trying too hard to look like a local." "My thoughts exactly," Hamish replied. The twine was new, bright orange, not weathered or frayed, and the silver platter. That came from the lodge. It's hard to imagine a local breaking into the lodge, stealing a tray, catching a fish, and then dragging Mr. Vane up to the stones just to make a point. "Vane was a bully," Archie said, leaning back. "He was up at the river 3 days ago, screaming at old Angus because the man was sitting on a bench near the bank. Claimed Angus was scouting his water. Angus hasn't fished for 10 years because of his eyes, but Vane wouldn't listen. He threatened to have the police on him." "Angus the post?" Hamish asked, his brow furrowing. "Vane mentioned him to me yesterday, called him riffraff." "Aye. But Angus wasn't the only one. He'd had a row with the cook he hired from Inverness too. Sent her packing yesterday morning without a week's pay because the toast was cold. She was seen waiting for the bus, cursing his name in Gaelic. And that's a curse that sticks, Hamish." Hamish leaned his head back against the wood panelling. The list of people who hated Julian Vane was growing by the minute, and it seemed to include everyone from high society guests to the local postal worker. But the murder was too deliberate, too carefully staged. It required time and a specific kind of cold-blooded theatricality. A disgruntled cook might spit in the soup, but she wouldn't arrange a trout on a silver platter. He thought back to the blue silk thread he'd seen on the standing stone. It was a delicate, expensive material. Not the sort of thing you'd find on a poacher's jacket or a cook's apron. He needed to see the guests, and he needed to do it before Blair completely alienated them and sent them scurrying back to London. "I think," Hamish said, standing up and stretching his long limbs, "it's time I paid my respects to the grieving party at Ardvair. They'll be wanting a bit of local sympathy, even if it comes from a useless peasant like myself." "Watch yourself, Hamish," Archie warned. "Blair's in a black mood. He's already hauled Billy the fish into the station for questioning." "Poor Billy," Hamish sighed. "He'll be happy enough for the warm room and the free tea, but he won't be able to tell Blair a thing. Billy can't even remember where he left his boots half the time, let alone where he was at midnight." As Hamish stepped back out into the biting wind, he felt the familiar weight of a Lochdubh mystery beginning to settle. It was not about fish or stones. It was about the friction between two worlds that never should have met. He climbed back into the Land Rover, lugs jumping into the passenger seat with a spray of muddy water, and turned the nose of the vehicle back toward the heights of Ardvair Lodge. He needed to find out who wore blue silk and who, among the wealthy visitors, knew enough about Highland insults to use a trout as a final insult. The drive back up to Ardvare Lodge was a sombre affair, the Land Rover's wipers struggling against a fresh onslaught of sleet that threatened to turn the track into a river of sludge. Hamish kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was back at the standing stones, visualizing that tiny snag of blue silk. It was a fragment of a different world, one that didn't belong in the rugged, mud-caked reality of a Highland winter. As he rounded the final bend, the lodge loomed out of the mist, a Victorian monstrosity of grey granite and sharp gables that looked as though it had been designed to discourage cheerfulness. Parked prominently in the gravel sweep was a sleek navy blue Jaguar that Hamish recognised immediately. It belonged to Priscilla Halberton Smythe. Her presence was both a relief and a complication. Priscilla, the daughter of the local landowner, was the one person who could navigate the thorny social thickets of the upper classes while keeping a foot firmly planted in the Highland soil. She was also the woman who occupied a permanent, albeit frustrating, corner of Hamish's heart. He parked near the kitchen entrance, hoping to avoid Blair's sentries at the front door. As he stepped out, the wind tried to snatch his cap, but he jammed it down and made for the side porch. He hadn't even reached the door when it swung open, and Priscilla stepped out, looking effortlessly elegant in a quilted gilet and tailored trousers. Her blonde hair was pulled back, and her pale blue eyes held a look of weary concern. "I thought I might find you skulking around the back, Hamish," she said, her voice a cool, steadying influence against the howling wind. "Blair is inside making an absolute pig's ear of things. He's currently shouting at a retired colonel about the definition of an alibi, and I fear the colonel is about to challenge him to a duel." "It's good to see you, Priscilla," Hamish said, giving her a small shy smile that he usually reserved for her alone. "I suppose you're here to act as a buffer for the gentry." "I'm here because the colonel is an old friend of my father's, and Julian Vane was, well, he was a business associate of several families in the county. It's a mess, Hamish, a very expensive, very public mess." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "He was a dreadful man, you know. He'd been squeezing his investors dry to pay for this lifestyle. Most of the people in that drawing room had a reason to want him gone, but none of them would be so gauche as to use a fish as a weapon. That's the thing that's bothering me," Hamish admitted, leaning against the stone wall of the porch. "The trout and the silver platter. It's like a parody of a Highland murder. It's too loud. It's what a Londoner thinks a Scotsman would do to show his displeasure." Priscilla nodded slowly. "The silver platter is from the lodge's formal set. I checked the dining room while Blair was busy insulting the maid. There's a gap in the sideboard where the largest salver should be. And Hamish, there's something else. Penelope, the young woman Vane was mentoring, has been wearing a very specific shade of blue lately, an Italian silk scarf that she claims she lost on the moors yesterday afternoon." Hamish felt a spark of interest. "Blue silk, you say? That's a very delicate thing to be wearing on a moor in this weather. Why would she be out there?" "She says Julian asked her to meet him to discuss her allowance. She claims she got lost, turned back because of the rain, and never saw him. But she came back to the lodge after dark, soaked to the bone and missing her scarf. She's terrified, Hamish. Not grieving, just terrified." Hamish rubbed his chin, the stubble rasping under his fingers. "And the colonel? What's his stake in this?" "Colonel Masterson lost his pension in one of Vane's property schemes. He's been staying here for a week, supposedly for the shooting, but I suspect he was actually here to demand his money back. I heard them arguing in the library 2 nights ago. Vane told him he'd get what was coming to him. Not exactly a subtle threat. In Lochdubh, when people say someone will get what's coming to them, it usually involves a lawyer or a fist, Hamish mused. But this was a performance. It required the killer to carry a dead man, a silver tray and a raw fish up to a standing stone in the middle of a gale. It's not a passion, Priscilla. That's an act of cold, calculated spite. Before Priscilla could respond, the heavy oak door behind them was flung open. DCI Blair stood there, his face purple, his tie askew. "Macbeth, I knew it. I knew I'd find you here, bothering the witnesses and sniffing around Miss Halberton Smythe like a stray mongrel. Get inside. I've got a room full of people who think they're above the law, and I want you to stand by the door and look like you're doing something useful while I break their stories." "Of course, sir," Hamish said, his voice instantly becoming thick and slow. "I was just asking Miss Priscilla here if she knew the best way to clean mud off a jaguar. It's a terrible shame about the paintwork, is it not?" Blair let out a sound like a boiling kettle. "The paintwork? A man is dead, you ginger-headed simpleton. Move now." Hamish winked at Priscilla, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement of his eyelid, and followed Blair into the grand hallway. The interior of Ardvare Lodge was a cavernous space filled with stag heads, heavy velvet curtains, and the palpable scent of old money and fresh panic. In the salon, guests were gathered like a group of bedraggled crows. There was the Colonel, tall and rigid with a moustache that twitched with every breath. There was Penelope, a waif-like girl with tear-streaked eyes, huddled in an armchair. And there was a third guest Hamish hadn't met, a man in a sharp grey suit who was calmly cleaning his spectacles, seemingly unmoved by the chaos. Hamish took his position by the door, hands folded behind his back, looking for all the world like a piece of the furniture. But beneath the peaked cap, his eyes were darting from person to person, noting the tension in the Colonel's hands, the way Penelope avoided looking at the sideboard, and the strange clinical detachment of the man in the grey suit. He remembered the blue silk thread on the stone and the way the trout had been placed. He didn't need a lab to tell him that the truth was in this room, hidden behind the polite veneers and the sharp English accents. He just had to wait for someone to say too much, or better yet, to say nothing at all. The drawing-room of Ardvare Lodge felt smaller than its physical dimensions suggested, the air heavy with the scent of damp wool and the unspoken accusations hanging between the guests. DCI Blair was pacing the length of a Persian rug, his boots leaving muddy imprints that would have made the recently departed cook weep with frustration. He was currently looming over Colonel Masterson, who sat stiffly in a wing-back chair, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of the seat. Hamish remained by the door, his eyes half-lidded as if he were nodding off, but he was acutely aware of every shift in the room's temperature. "So, Colonel," Blair barked, his voice echoing off the high corniced ceiling, "you admit you had a disagreement with Mr. Vane regarding certain financial matters, and you admit you were seen walking toward the standing stones yesterday evening to clear your head. It's a bit of a coincidence, isn't it? A man who stole your pension ends up dead in the very spot you chose for a stroll." "It was no coincidence, Inspector," the Colonel snapped, his moustache quivering with indignant rage. "I told you, I went out to find the man because he hadn't appeared for dinner. I never reached the stones. The weather was foul, and my hip was acting up. I turned back before I reached the plateau. As for the money, yes, I was angry, but I am a soldier, not a butcher. I don't go about strangling people with baling twine and decorating them with fish. A soldier who knows exactly how to use a garrote," Blair countered, a triumphant sneer curling his lip. "And as for the fish, maybe it was your joke idea. A bit of psychological warfare? Anderson, bring in the evidence bag." Detective Sergeant Anderson stepped forward, holding a clear plastic bag containing a pair of heavy waxed cotton gaiters taken from the Colonel's room. They were caked in the same greyish clay that Hamish had noted at the crime scene. Blair pointed at them with a meaty finger. "Explain that, Colonel. That clay only exists in the basin around the standing stones. You were there. You stood over him." The Colonel looked at the gaiters, his face pale. I must have stepped in it earlier in the day. We were out scouting the deer paths. Liars always have an excuse, Blair growled. I think you caught him up there, lost your temper, and decided to settle the debt in blood. You're under arrest, Masterson. We'll finish this conversation in Strathbane. Hamish cleared his throat, a soft, apologetic sound that nevertheless cut through Blair's tirade. Blair spun around, his face darkening to a dangerous shade of magenta. What is it now, Macbeth? Did you find a stray kitten that needs rescuing? It's just a small thing, sir, Hamish said, stepping forward with a look of profound confusion. About the Colonel's gaiters. They are very good, aren't they? Sturdy. But I noticed something when I was looking at the Colonel's boots earlier. They're perfectly clean. Not a speck of that grey clay on the soles or the laces. Now, if a man were to walk through that muck at the Standing Stones, he'd have it in every nook and cranny of his footwear. But the gaiters? They're covered in it, even on the inside of the ankle straps. Blair stared at him, blinking. What are you blethering about? It's just... It looks as though someone held the gaiters and rubbed them into the mud by hand, Hamish explained, his voice mild. And there's the matter of the Colonel's hip. He limps to the left, sir. If he'd been dragging a heavy man like Mr. Vane up that steep incline, the pressure would have been all on his right side. There would be deep, uneven scuff marks on the toes of his boots. But those boots in the hallway, they're as smooth as a baby's cheek. He could have changed his boots, Blair yelled, though he sounded slightly less certain. He could have, sir, but he'd have had to burn the old ones, and the fireplace in his room hasn't been lit since Tuesday. I checked the ash, and there's one more thing. Hamish turned his gaze toward Penelope, who was clutching a lace handkerchief so tightly her fingers were blue. Miss Penelope, I couldn't help but notice that beautiful blue dress you're wearing under your cardigan. It's a lovely match for that silk scarf Miss Priscilla mentioned you lost. Penelope gasped, her hand flying to her throat. I don't know what you mean. It's just that I found a tiny thread of blue silk up at the Stones, Hamish said, lying with the effortless grace of a man who knew he wouldn't be checked, right on the jagged edge of the fingerstone. It seemed strange, because a lady like yourself wouldn't be wandering around a muddy archaeological site in silk, unless, of course, someone wanted it to look like you had been there. The man in the grey suit, who had remained silent until now, suddenly spoke. This is all very speculative, Constable. Are you suggesting someone is framing the guests? Hamish looked at him. This was the man Priscilla hadn't named, Vane's lawyer, a Mr. Luff. He had a face like a ledger, and eyes that seemed to be calculating the cost of every word spoken. I'm suggesting, Hamish said, that the scene at the Stones was a bit too perfect. It had the Colonel's mud and the lady's silk. It had a local's fish and a farmer's twine. It's like a recipe where someone's put in every ingredient they could find to make sure the blame landed anywhere but on themselves. DCI Blair is right that it's a performance, but the lead actor hasn't taken a bow yet. Blair looked from the Colonel to Hamish, his chest heaving. He hated being corrected, but the lack of clay on the Colonel's boots was a forensic hole even he couldn't ignore. Fine, Anderson, uncuff him for now. But nobody leaves this house. Macbeth, if you're wrong about this, I'll have you directing traffic in a Glasgow fog by Monday. Hamish nodded, his expression remaining one of dull obedience. He retreated toward the door, catching Priscilla's eye. She looked impressed, but also worried. He knew he had successfully derailed Blair's impulsive arrest, but he had also alerted the real killer. Someone in this house was very clever, very cold, and currently watching him with a new, dangerous interest. As he stepped out back into the hallway, the weight of the silver platter returned to his mind. The platter was missing from the sideboard, but who would know exactly where it was kept, and who would have the freedom to move about the house with a raw trout without being noticed? He needed to speak to the invisible people, the ones who saw everything but were never looked at. He needed to find the source of that orange twine. Hamish slipped out of the drawing room just as Blair began a fresh round of interrogation, his voice muffled by the thick oak doors. The hallway was quiet. save for the ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a hammer against an anvil in the stillness of the house. He didn't head for the front door. Instead, he made his way toward the back of the lodge, where the air grew colder and smelled faintly of floor wax and old grease. He found himself in the scullery, a stark contrast to the velvet-draped opulence of the main house. There, sitting at a scrubbed wooden table, was a woman he hadn't seen before, a small, bird-like figure in a neat black dress, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. "You'll be Mrs. McTavish," Hamish said softly, pulling out a chair and sitting down with a groan that suggested his bones were older than they were. "The housekeeper. I'm sorry for the intrusion. It's a weary day for everyone." The woman looked up, her eyes wide and watery. "It's a curse, Constable. I told Mr. Vane when he arrived that you cannot treat the Highlands like a playground. He laughed at me, he called me a quaint relic. And now look at him." "He wasn't a man for listening," Hamish agreed, watching her carefully. "I was looking at the sideboard in the dining room. There's a silver salver missing, the large with the old owner's family crest. Do you remember when it was last seen?" Mrs. McTavish's lips thinned into a hard line. "It was there yesterday afternoon when I set the table for tea, but Mr. Vane had a row with Mr. Luff, the lawyer. They were in the dining room and there was a sound of breaking glass. When I went in to check, Mr. Vane told me to clear out and take the silver with me. He was in a black rage, he was, but the salver, I didn't take it. I thought he'd moved it himself to make room for his ledgers." Hamish leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "And the orange twine, Mrs. McTavish? I saw a roll of it in the mudroom earlier, the kind used for tying up the garden waste. Is that where it's kept?" "It was," she whispered. "But the roll is gone. I looked for it this morning to tie up some kindling, and it wasn't there. Someone has been through my cupboards, Constable. Someone who knows where the house keeps its secrets." Hamish nodded, his mind spinning. The killer wasn't just staging a scene, they were using the house itself as a toolkit. He stood up, thanking the housekeeper, and wandered back toward the mudroom. As he passed a small alcove used for coats, he spotted a pair of boots, not the Colonel's, but a pair of sturdy, expensive walking shoes that belonged to the lawyer, Mr. Luff. They were clean, almost too clean, as if they had been scrubbed with a brush. But on the very edge of the heel, tucked into the stitching, was a single tiny scale of a fish. The pieces began to click together with the sickening clarity of a mountain stream. The motive wasn't the petty resentment of a guest or the fear of a mistress. It was something more clinical. Julian Vane had been bleeding his investors dry, but he had also been bleeding his own business. Mr. Luff, the man who kept the books, would have known that better than anyone. If Vane died under mysterious circumstances that looked like a local feud or a crime of passion among the guests, the investigation would focus on the drama, not the ledgers. And in the chaos of a murder trial, a clever lawyer could make a lot of money disappear. Hamish walked back into the main hall just as Priscilla was coming down the stairs. She looked at him, seeing the change in his expression, the way the deceptive laziness had been replaced by a focused predatory stillness. "You've found something," she whispered, stepping into the shadow of the staircase. "The trout wasn't just an insult, Priscilla," Hamish said, his voice barely audible. "It was a distraction. It was meant to make us think of poachers and locals. The twine was meant to make us think of farmers. The silk was meant to frame Penelope. It's too much. The killer is someone who thinks they're smarter than the rest of us put together. Someone who thinks a Highland policeman wouldn't know the difference between a real crime and a stage play." "Who, Hamish?" "The one who hasn't lost his temper," Hamish replied. "The one who's been watching Blair like a scientist watching a bug under a glass. But I need more than a fish scale and a theory. I need to make him think he's won." He looked toward the drawing-room door. He could hear Blair shouting again, probably threatening to arrest the entire village by nightfall. Hamish knew he couldn't go to Blair with his suspicions. The man would only ruin the trap. He had to play the part of the useless peasant one last time. He had to make the killer feel so safe, so superior, that they would commit the one error every arrogant person eventually makes, the error of underestimating their opponent. "Priscilla," Hamish said, his eyes bright, "I need you to do something for me. Something that involves that Jaguar of yours and a bit of a lie. I need you to go back to the hotel and tell everyone, loudly, that the police have found a witness, a local who saw the whole thing from the woods. Tell them the witness is coming to the station tonight to give a full description of the man they saw at the stones." Priscilla smiled, a sharp, dangerous look that reminded Hamish why he loved her. "A phantom witness. I think I can manage that. And who is this mysterious person?" "No one," Hamish said. "But by the time the sun goes down, our killer is going to be very interested in making sure that witness never speaks. And I'll be waiting in the dark to see who comes calling." As Priscilla slipped out the front door, Hamish returned to the drawing room. He slumped against the door frame, his face once again a mask of dull indifference. He watched Mr. Luff, who was calmly reading a newspaper as if he were in a London club. The lawyer looked up, his eyes meeting Hamish's for a brief second. There was no fear in them, only a cold, intellectual curiosity. Hamish tipped his cap and looked away. The trap was set. Now he just had to wait for the predator to become the prey. The Highland night was coming, and in the dark of Lochdubh, the land had a way of revealing the truth to those who knew how to listen. The shadows lengthened across the rugged face of Ben Bruey as the afternoon light surrendered to a bruised purple twilight. Back at the police station, Hamish Macbeth moved with a deliberate slowness that would have driven DCI Blair to a state of apoplexy. He stoked a peat fire in the small hearth until it gave off a comforting, earthy glow, the scent of the smoke mingling with the steam rising from a fresh pot of coffee. Lugs lay stretched out across the rug, his paws twitching as he chased phantom hares in his sleep. To any passer-by looking through the window, it appeared to be a picture of perfect Highland indolence, a lazy policeman settling in for a quiet night, while a murderer remained at large. But Hamish's mind was far from restful. He had spent the last hour meticulously preparing his witness. In the corner of the station's small holding cell, which was currently empty of prisoners, he had propped up a stuffed dummy made of old sacks and a spare police tunic. From a distance, in the dim light of the hallway, it looked remarkably like a man sitting in a chair with his back to the door. It was an old trick, one that would never fool a professional, but Hamish wasn't dealing with a professional criminal. He was dealing with an intellectual who believed everyone around him was a secondary character in his own grand design. A sharp knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find Priscilla, her cheeks flushed from the cold and her eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt. She entered, shaking the moisture from her coat. "It's done, Hamish," she whispered, moving toward the fire. "I went to the hotel and made quite a scene in the lounge. I told the manager, loud enough for the Colonel and Mr. Luff to hear, that you were terribly excited because a local shepherd had seen a man in a dark coat carrying a large silver object near the stones. I said the witness was being kept under guard here at the station until Blair returns from Strathbane to take the official statement." "And how did they take it?" Hamish asked, handing her a coffee mug. The Colonel looked confused, as he usually does, Priscilla replied, taking a grateful sip. But Luff didn't even look up from his papers. He just stopped writing for a split second. His hand stayed perfectly still over the page. It was the only sign he heard me. "He's a cold fish, Hamish. If it's him, he won't panic like a normal man. He'll try to handle it logically." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Hamish said. "A logical man knows that a witness is a variable that must be eliminated or discredited. He won't come here to kill, not at first. He'll come to see who the witness is, to see if he can buy them off or find a way to make their testimony look like the ramblings of a drunk. But he has to come. Arrogance demands that he seize the threat for himself." He checked his watch. The village was settling into the deep, heavy silence that precedes a Highland storm. The wind had picked up again, whistling through the eaves of the station and rattling the heavy iron latch on the door. He turned down the lamps until the room was bathed in nothing but the flickering orange light of the peat fire. "You should go, Priscilla," Hamish said gently. "If things get messy, I don't want you anywhere near the fallout. Blair will be looking for any excuse to have me disciplined, and endangering a civilian is high on his list." "Don't be silly, Hamish. I'm staying," she countered, her chin setting in a line of stubbornness he knew well. "Besides, if you solve this without me, who's going to make sure you don't give the credit to the dog?" Hamish chuckled, though the sound was tight. He moved to the back of the station, positioning himself in the shadows of the small kitchenette that looked out into the main office. From here, he had a clear view of the front door and the entrance to the cells. He reached into his pocket and felt the cold steel of his handcuffs. He didn't like using them. They felt like a failure of persuasion, but he knew that tonight persuasion wouldn't be enough. Hours passed. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock seemed to slow down, each second heavy with anticipation. Outside, the rain turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. Suddenly, Luggs lifted his head, his ears swiveling toward the front door. A low, vibrating growl started in the back of the dog's throat. Hamish placed a silent, steadying hand on the dog's neck. Through the frosted glass of the station door, a shadow appeared. It was tall and thin, distorted by the weather and the dim light of the street lamp outside. The shadow lingered for a long moment, as if debating whether to proceed. Then the latch clicked. It was a soft, practiced sound, the sound of someone used to moving through quiet offices and library halls. The door creaked open, admitting a swirl of freezing mist and a man in a long, dark overcoat. He stood in the entryway, his face obscured by the darkness. But the way he held himself, the rigid, upright posture and the slight tilt of the head, was unmistakable. It was Mr. Luff. He didn't call out. He did not ask Constable. He simply stood there, his eyes scanning the room until they settled on the door to the holding cells. He moved across the floor with the silent grace of a predator, his polished shoes making no sound on the floorboards. As he reached the cell door, he reached into the pocket of his coat. Hamish felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had expected a bribe or a conversation, but the lawyer's hand emerged clutching a heavy, blunt object, a brass paperweight from Vane's own desk at the lodge. "It's a long way from the city for a late-night visit, Mr. Luff," Hamish said, stepping out from the shadows of the kitchenette. Luff spun around, his face a mask of pale, startled fury. The transition from the calm, detached professional to the cornered animal was instantaneous. He looked at Hamish, then at the dummy in the cell, then back to the tall, red-haired policeman standing between him and the exit. For a moment, the only sound was the howling of the wind outside. "Constable Macbeth," Luff said, his voice regaining its oily composure with terrifying speed. "I noticed the light was on. I was concerned for your safety, given the volatile nature of the locals. Is that right?" Hamish asked, his voice dropping into that deceptively soft Highland lilt. "And did you bring that brass weight to help protect me? Or were you worried my witness might have an unfortunate accident before DCI Blair arrived?" Luff's grip on the paperweight tightened. The mask was slipping now, revealing a desperate, jagged edge underneath. "You're a clever man, Macbeth, too clever for a village like this. It's a pity you don't know when to look the other way." The tension in the room snapped like a dry twig. Luff didn't try to explain further. He lunged, not toward the door, but toward Hamish, the heavy brass weight raised high. He was a man driven by the cold logic of survival. In his mind, Hamish was the only variable left to eliminate. The sudden surge of the lawyer was more desperate than skillful, but it carried the terrifying weight of a man who had everything to lose. Mr. Luff, usually so contained and meticulously ordered, swung the brass paperweight with a frantic, whistling arc that narrowly missed the side of Hamish's head. Hamish, despite his gangling appearance and the languid way he usually moved, possessed the deceptive agility of a Highland deer. He stepped back into the kitchenette, his boots squeaking on the linoleum, as the heavy brass ornament smashed into a wooden cupboard door with a sickening crack splintering the pine. Now, Mr. Luff," Hamish said, his voice remaining remarkably steady even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "That's government property you're damaging. I'd advise you to put the weight down before things become truly unpleasant for us both." Luff didn't listen. His face was no longer that of the cool, calculating legal mind. It was a distorted mask of sweat and panic. He realized the trap had been sprung, that the witness in the cell was nothing but sacks and a tunic, and that his very presence here in the dead of night, armed and aggressive, was a confession in itself. He lunged again, this time trying to use his superior height to pin Hamish against the sink. He was a man who spent his days behind a desk, but the adrenaline of a cornered predator lent him a frantic, wiry strength. Luggs, sensing the danger to his master, didn't hesitate. The dog let out a sharp, ferocious bark and clamped his jaws onto the thick wool of Luff's overcoat sleeve. It wasn't a deep bite, but it was enough to throw the lawyer off balance. Luff let out a yelp of surprise and frustration, swinging his arm to dislodge the animal. In that split second of distraction, Hamish moved. He didn't use a punch or a grand cinematic maneuver. Instead, he used a simple, effective trip he had learned from a local wrestler years ago. He caught Luff's ankle with his boot and gave a sharp shove to the man's chest. The lawyer went down hard, the brass paperweight clattering across the floor and disappearing under the station desk. He landed with a heavy thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small building. Before Luff could scramble back to his feet, Hamish was on him, his long limbs pinning the man to the floorboards. There was a brief, messy struggle, a tangle of limbs and gasping breaths, before the metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the room. "Stay still, man," Hamish panted, his red hair falling over his eyes. "It's over. You've had your run, and now you're just making a mess of my station." Priscilla stepped out from behind the heavy curtain of the main office, her face pale but her expression one of grim satisfaction. She looked down at the panting, defeated figure of the lawyer. "I believe that qualifies as a confession, Hamish. I don't think even the most expensive legal team in London can explain away a midnight assault on a police officer with a stolen paperweight." Luff stopped struggling. He lay there with his cheek pressed against the cold wood, the arrogance finally draining out of him, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. He was going to ruin everything, Luff whispered, his voice cracking. Vane was a fool. He was gambling with money that wasn't his. I built that firm. I kept the books balanced while he played the country squire. When he told me he was going to confess to the regulators to save his own skin and leave me to take the fall, I couldn't let it happen. He didn't deserve the life he had, let alone the mercy he expected. "So you decided to play the part of a Highland ghost," Hamish said, slowly standing up and brushing the dust from his uniform. He felt a wave of exhaustion washing over him. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the dull ache of a long day and the lingering chill of the storm outside. The trout, rocks, twine. You thought if you made it look like a local grudge, the police would spend months chasing shadows in the glen, while you quietly moved the funds and vanished. It should have worked, Luff spat, a spark of his former bitterness returning. The inspector, Blair, he was exactly what I expected. Impatient, loud, and easily led by his own prejudices. He was ready to arrest the colonel. He would have been happy to arrest any of these peasants. "I didn't tell you, Macbeth. You're supposed to be a nobody, a lazy, incompetent village constable." "That's the secret, Mr. Luff," Hamish said, reaching down to haul the man into a sitting position. "People only see what they want to see. You wanted to see a fool, so that's what I gave you, but in Lochdubh we have a way of looking past the surface. We have to, otherwise we'd never survive the winters." Hamish led the handcuffed lawyer toward the holding cell, the real one this time, not the one occupied by the dummy. As he turned the key in the lock, he felt no sense of triumph, only a deep, weary sadness. Julian Vane had been a terrible man, but the cold, calculated way Luff had discarded his life was a reminder of the darkness that could hide behind a polished exterior. The storm outside had reached its crescendo, the rain lashing against the windows with a ferocity that seemed to demand entry. Hamish walked back to the fireplace and poked the embers, trying to coax the warmth back into the room. Priscilla joined him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "What now, Hamish?" she asked quietly. "Blair will be here tomorrow. He won't be happy that you solved the case under his nose." Hamish looked at the fire, a slow, cunning smile spreading across his face. "Aye, Blair will be in a foul mood indeed. He'll see this as an insult to his authority. Unless, of course, we make sure he sees it as his own personal victory. I have no desire to be the hero of Strathbane, Priscilla. If I'm a hero, they'll want to promote me. They'll want to send me to a big, noisy station in the city where there's no time for fishing and the coffee is always burnt. I think I've a better plan." He looked toward the desk where the telephone sat, silent and black. Within hours the village would awaken. The news of the arrest would spread from the post office to the hotel and down to the harbour. The mystery of trout and standing stones would be the talk of the Highlands for years to come. But as far as the official records were concerned, Hamish Macbeth intended to remain exactly what everyone thought he was, a lucky, slow-witted policeman who had happened to be in the right place at the right time, while a brilliant detective chief inspector directed the operation from afar. "You're going to give it to him, aren't you?" Priscilla asked, her eyes dancing with amusement. "You're going to let that man take the credit for your work. It's a small price to pay for peace and quiet," Hamish replied, finally sitting down in his chair and picking up his mug of coffee. It was stone cold, but he didn't care. Blair gets a medal, I get to keep my house, and Luggs gets to keep his favourite rug. It's a fair trade in my book. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment as the warmth of the fire finally began to seep into his bones. The case was solved, the killer was behind bars, and Lochdubh's deceptive laziness could return to its natural state. But before he could truly rest, he had a very delicate telephone call to make, one that would require all of his Highland charm and every ounce of his ability to tell a very convincing lie. He had to make sure Blair felt like the smartest man in Scotland, and that was a task that would require a truly masterful performance. The first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the mist, turning the rain-slicked streets of Lochdubh into a shimmering, leaden mirror. Inside the police station, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool and the stale dregs of coffee. Mr. Luff sat slumped in the holding cell, his face a ghostly mask of ruin, staring at the floor as if trying to calculate where his meticulous logic had fractured. Priscilla had finally departed, promising to keep the night's events a secret until the official version was established. Hamish sat by the telephone, his hand hovering over the receiver. He knew that the next 10 minutes would be more dangerous than the physical struggle with the lawyer. He was about to engage in the delicate art of massaging the massive, fragile ego of DCI Blair. He lifted the receiver and dialed the number for the Strathbane headquarters. When the line connected, the voice on the other end was like a rusty saw blade cutting through silk. It was Blair, sounding as though he had spent the night sleeping on a bed of nails and broken glass. "What is it, Macbeth?" Blair roared, his voice distorted by the poor connection. "If you're calling to tell me you've lost the keys to your own station again, I'll have your badge for breakfast." "Oh, no, sir," Hamish said, pitching his voice into a tone of breathless, wide-eyed admiration. "It's about your theory, sir, the one you mentioned yesterday at the Stones, the one about the insider and the theatrical distraction. It was brilliant, sir, utterly brilliant." There was a long, pregnant silence on the other end of the line. Hamish could almost hear the gears of Blair's vanity grinding as the man tried to remember ever saying such a thing. "My theory? Of course, Macbeth. I knew I'd mentioned the insider angle. It was obvious from the start to a trained eye." "Exactly, sir," Hamish continued, leaning back and winking at Luggs, who was watching him with a sceptical expression. "I took the liberty of following up on your brilliant hunch about the lawyer, Mr. Luff. I remembered you saying that we should keep a sharp eye on the professional types. Well, I set a small watch on the station, just as you suggested in your, implicit instructions, and would you believe it? The man practically broke the door, trying to destroy evidence. He even attacked me with a brass weight, sir. But I kept thinking to myself, what would the inspector do? And I managed to secure him. He's in the cell right now, confessing everything about the embezzlement and the trout. He is he? Blair's voice had changed. The anger was gone, replaced by a greedy, purring tone of triumph. And you say he's confessed to the whole thing, the embezzlement, the murder? Aye, sir, he's singing like a lark. But I told him, I said, it's no use trying to hide because DCI Blair has been 3 steps ahead of you since the moment he stepped off the boat. He's quite broken, sir. He knows he never stood a chance against your methods. Well, Macbeth, Blair said, sounding significantly more cheerful, it's good to see you are actually paying attention for once. I'll be there within the hour. Do not, I repeat, do not let anyone else speak to him. This is a high-profile collar, and I want the press briefing handled properly. I'll make sure your name is mentioned in the report, somewhere in the footnotes about local assistance. You did your job, Constable. You stayed out of the way and let the plan work. Thank you, sir, Hamish said, his face a mask of humble gratitude. I'll have the kettle on for you, and I'll make sure the cell is clean. We wouldn't want the Chief Constable seeing a mess when he hears about your success. He hung up the phone and let out a long, slow breath. The danger of promotion had passed. By the time Blair arrived with a fleet of sirens and a gaggle of reporters from the Inverness papers, the story would be set in stone. Blair's intuition had trapped a white-collar killer in the wilds of the Highlands. Hamish would be seen as nothing more than a glorified doorman, a lucky subordinate who had held the fort while the great man did the thinking. It was exactly where he wanted to be. The hour passed in a flurry of activity as Hamish tidied the station, ensuring that the dummy made of sacks was safely hidden away in the coal shed. He didn't want Blair asking questions about phantom witnesses that didn't fit the official narrative of superior police intuition. He also took the time to fry a couple of eggs on the small stove in the back, the sizzle of the fat providing a domestic counterpoint to the high-stakes drama unfolding in the cell. When the sirens finally wailed through the village, the locals began to emerge from their cottages, peering through curtains and huddled in doorways. 3 police cars screeched to a halt outside the station. Blair burst through the door like a hurricane in a cheap suit. Sergeant Anderson and a young officer with a camera accompanied him. "Move aside, Macbeth," Blair barked, not even looking at the constable as he marched toward the cell. He stood before the bars, his chest puffed out like a prize pigeon. "So, Luff, you thought you could outsmart the Strathbane CID, did you? You thought a few theatrical tricks with a fish would throw me off the scent?" Luff looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took in the red-faced, shouting man. He looked at Hamish, who was standing by the stove with a spatula in one hand, looking remarkably like a man who struggled to tie his own shoelaces. Luff opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to mention the trap, the dummy, or the fact that it was the useless constable who had actually outmanoeuvred him. "I wouldn't, if I were you," Hamish said softly, his voice barely audible over Blair's bluster. He gave the lawyer a very specific, steady look. "The inspector is very generous. If you cooperate with his brilliant reconstruction, I'm sure he'll mention your remorse to the fiscal. But if you try to make him look foolish, well, the Strathbane cells are a lot less comfortable than this one, and the food is much worse." Luff looked at the purple-faced Blair, then back at the calm, red-haired Highlander. He realized then that he was caught between 2 different kinds of power, one that shouted and one that listened. He chose the one that offered the least resistance. "I realized," Luff said, his voice cold and flat, "that I was being outmatched. Your presence at the lodge, Inspector, it was quite formidable. I knew it was only a matter of time." Blair beamed, his smile so wide it looked painful. "Did you get that, Anderson? Put it in the notes. Suspect admitted he was overwhelmed by the inspector's formidable presence. Excellent. Now get him in the car. We've got a press conference to prepare for. As the police team hauled Luff away, the station suddenly felt very empty and very quiet. Blair lingered for a moment, adjusting his tie in the mirror above the mantelpiece. He looked at Hamish, who was once again slumped in his chair, looking half asleep. "You're a lucky man, Macbeth," Blair said, not unkindly. "To be part of a case like this, it'll look good on your record. Not that it matters. You'll be a village constable until the day they bury you in the peat. You haven't got the drive for the big city. No ambition." "No, sir," Hamish agreed, his hazel eyes fixed on the flickering embers of the fire. "I suppose I haven't. I just like the quiet, you see." "Quiet? You're welcome to it." Blair turned on his heel and marched out, the door slamming shut behind him. The sound of the departing sirens faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of the rain and the rhythmic ticking of the clock. Hamish sat in silence for long, the weight of the last 48 hours finally lifting from his shoulders. He reached down and patted Luggs, who had returned to his position on the rug. "Well, Luggs," Hamish murmured, "the great man has his glory, the lawyer has his cell, and we have the rest of the day to ourselves. And I believe there's still a sea trout in the larder that didn't end up on a silver platter." The village of Lochdubh began to return to its usual rhythm. The gossip would continue for weeks, and the story of the trout murder would pass into local legend, but for P.C. Hamish Macbeth, the world had righted itself. The outsider was gone, the peace had been restored, and most importantly, his secret remained safe. He was still the smartest man in the Highlands, and as long as everyone believed he was a lazy fool, he could continue to enjoy the life he loved in the only place he ever wanted to be. The sirens had long since faded into the mist of the Pass of Itchen, leaving Lochdubh to the much-preferred sounds of gulls crying over the harbour and the rhythmic shush-shush of the tide against the pier. The silver Porsche was gone, towed to a police lot in Strathbane. The high society guests had scattered like autumn leaves back to the safety of London, leaving Ardvare Lodge once again to the ghosts and the damp. Hamish Macbeth stood at his kitchen window, watching the fine Highland rain settle over the loch. He had already changed out of his formal uniform and into his favourite thick-knit jumper, the one with the frayed cuffs and the faint scent of wood smoke. On the stove, a pot of coffee was beginning to gurgle, sending a rich dark aroma through the small station house. Luggs was already in his favourite spot by the fire, his tail occasionally thumping the floor in a dream state of absolute security. A light, familiar knock at the door made Hamish smile. He didn't need to check the peephole to know it was Priscilla. She entered with a bottle of single malt tucked under her arm and a look of amused resignation on her face. "I've just seen the afternoon editions of the Inverness Courier," she said, setting the whisky on the table. "DCI Blair is on the front page, looking remarkably like a toad that swallowed a particularly large and delicious fly. The headline reads, 'Blair's brilliant gambit snares city fraudster. There isn't a single mention of a red-haired constable or a dog with one ear.'" "Perfect," Hamish said, pouring 2 cups of coffee and adding a generous splash of the malt. "I couldn't have written it better myself. If the chief constable thinks Blair is the mastermind, he'll keep him busy with all the big noisy cases in the south, and he'll leave the useless Macbeth to rot in peace up here in the heather." Priscilla sat at the small table looking around the cluttered, cosy kitchen. "You really do enjoy it, don't you? Letting them think you're a fool while you hold all the strings. It's a dangerous game, Hamish. One of these days someone might actually realize you're the smartest man in the county." "God forbid," Hamish replied with a shudder. "I'd be promoted to an office in Glasgow before I could finish my breakfast. I'd have to wear a tie every day and attend meetings about synergy and statistical outcomes. No, Priscilla, I'm quite happy being the local simpleton. It gives a man time to think, and more importantly, time to fish." The conversation drifted, as it often did, to the small gossip of the village. He told her how Mrs. Wellington had already claimed credit for calling the police, and how Archie McLean was currently trying to convince the tourists at the hotel that the trout on the platter had been a message from the Kelpies. The darkness of the murder, the cold, calculated greed of Mr. Luff, seemed to recede into the background, becoming just another layer of Highland history that soaked into the very stones of the glen. As the evening deepened, Priscilla eventually stood to leave, pausing at the door to squeeze Hamish's hand. "You did good, Hamish, even if nobody knows it but us. Vane was a monster, but he didn't deserve to be a prop in a lawyer's stage play. You gave him a bit of truth at the end. In the Highlands, the truth has a way of coming out eventually," Hamish mused. "It just sometimes needs a bit of a shove from a lazy policeman." After she left, Hamish didn't immediately go to bed. He sat by the fire with lugs, the only light in the room coming from the glowing peat embers. He thought about the blue silk thread and the orange twine, and the way the trout's eye had looked in the moonlight. He felt a deep, quiet satisfaction, not because he had outwitted a clever man from the city, though that was a pleasant bonus, but because the rhythm of Lochdubh had been restored. The gears of the world were turning smoothly again, and his small corner of it was safe for another season. He reached for a worn book on his side table, but his eyes drifted toward the window instead. The clouds were breaking, revealing a sliver of a cold, bright moon over the peaks. Tomorrow will be a fine day, perhaps fine enough to head back down to the Andoo and see if that sea trout he'd missed was still lurking in the shadows of the bridge. He blew out the lamp, the smell of the wick lingering in the air. "Come on, Lugs," he whispered in the dark. "Bedtime. We'll have a busy day of doing absolutely nothing tomorrow, and I wouldn't want to be late for it." The station house fell silent, a small, sturdy bastion of peace against the vast wild beauty of the mountains. Somewhere out there the wind whistled through the ancient standing stones. But inside, the only sound was the steady, contented breathing of a man who was exactly where he was meant to be.